They came to Elan School seeking help, but for many, it became a test of endurance, fear, and strict discipline. Behind the gates of Poland, Maine, adolescents faced rigid routines, confrontational exercises, and a constant hierarchy of authority. Every chore, every session, every interaction was monitored, leaving little room for privacy or choice. Some left with lessons in responsibility, others with lasting emotional scars. Officially licensed and promoted as therapeutic, the school's reality often diverged from what parents were told. The stories of those who lived through it reveal a complex legacy, both formative and controversial. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into stories you won't find anywhere else. Hit the bell icon so you never miss out. In 1970, Gerald Davidson founded the Elan School in Poland, Maine, as a private residential program for adolescents labeled as troubled. Davidson had previous experience in psychiatric and behavioral programs and envisioned a structured environment where teens facing behavioral, emotional, or substance-related challenges could be guided toward more orderly lives. Elan was part of a wider network of therapeutic boarding schools that emerged in the United States during the 1960s and 1970s, a period when families sought alternatives to public schools or traditional psychiatric care for adolescents. From its inception, Elan emphasized strict discipline and behavioral modification. The campus consisted of residential buildings, administrative offices, classrooms, and recreational spaces. Students were expected to live on-site for extended periods, participating in a combination of educational instruction, labor assignments, and therapy-oriented exercises. Families were often told that the program would instill responsibility, structure, and self-discipline. Investigative reports and alumni accounts confirm that this regimen was enforced with a hierarchy of authority, with staff wielding control over students' daily routines, activities, and interactions. The school maintained official licensing through the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, though oversight was reportedly inconsistent. Early years saw the implementation of programs designed to correct behavioral issues, but over time, allegations emerged that the methods employed could be harsh, including physical restraint and confrontational group sessions. Media investigations later highlighted that while some students experienced improved behavior and academic engagement, others described fear, humiliation, and emotional distress during their time at Elan. By the 1980s, Elan had grown in size and reputation. Families continued to enroll their children, believing in the therapeutic value of its structured environment, while alumni and staff accounts increasingly revealed the intensity and rigor of daily life. The school operated for over 4 decades, ultimately closing in 2011, leaving behind a complicated legacy that combines documented behavioral reform with accounts of distressing experiences for many students. Following its establishment in 1970, the Elan School expanded its enrollment gradually. Initially, it drew primarily from families in New England, many of whom sought alternative interventions for adolescents who had experienced academic difficulties, behavioral challenges, or early substance experimentation. Admissions records and alumni accounts indicate that some students were referred by therapists, social workers, or other professionals, while others were placed there by concerned parents seeking intensive oversight. The early operational philosophy of the school combined elements of therapeutic intervention, work-based responsibility, and strict discipline. Staff manuals and internal documents, referenced in media investigations and court filings, indicate that students were expected to adhere to detailed schedules and participate in what the school termed corrective exercises. These exercises were designed to address specific behavioral issues, ranging from defiance and non-compliance to emotional volatility. Alumni later described these exercises as confrontational in nature, sometimes involving group criticism or peer accountability sessions, always under the supervision of staff. Staffing at the school reflected a hierarchical model intended to reinforce authority. Senior administrators oversaw day-to-day operations and the overall curriculum, while counselors, residential monitors, and other personnel were tasked with maintaining constant supervision. Reports indicate that the staff-to-student ratio was variable, often depending on enrollment levels and the presence of trained personnel for behavioral management. Former staff members reported that their training emphasized consistent enforcement of rules, behavioral correction, and adherence to institutional routines, rather than traditional educational pedagogy or therapeutic counseling alone. During its first 2 decades, Elan became increasingly known both for its strict regimen and for the intensity of its programs. Media coverage from the 1980s references complaints and concerns from families and local community members regarding the institution's disciplinary practices. While the school continued to operate under state licensing requirements, inspections and oversight were sporadic, leaving gaps in accountability. Alumni accounts corroborate these reports, noting periods during which enforcement of the rules was especially rigorous and when supervisory oversight of staff behavior varied. The broader cultural context also shaped the school's development. In the 1970s and 1980s, the troubled teen industry in the United States was largely unregulated, and families had limited access to independent verification of program efficacy. This context contributed to Elan's ability to operate with considerable autonomy, applying behavioral interventions that some later described as extreme. State documents and investigative journalism highlight that, while the school marketed itself as a therapeutic institution, the operational focus on conformity, obedience, and intensive behavior modification distinguished it from mainstream educational or psychiatric programs. Despite growing scrutiny, Elan continued to receive referrals from families, therapists, and agencies over the decades. By the 1990s, the school had enrolled hundreds of students, and alumni accounts indicate that the structure and routines remained consistent. A combination of education, chores, labor responsibilities, behavioral exercises, and supervised recreation. Documentation suggests that this model persisted for the school's entire operational history, reflecting a consistent philosophy of discipline and behavioral control from its founding through its closure in 2011. Life at the Elan School was highly structured, leaving students with little autonomy over their daily activities. Verified alumni accounts, court documents, and investigative journalism describe a schedule that began early in the morning, often with wake-up times between 6 o'clock and 7 a.m. Students were immediately assigned to chores, which could include cleaning dormitories, maintaining campus grounds, assisting in kitchens, or performing laundry duties. These responsibilities were presented as part of the school's philosophy of instilling discipline, responsibility, and teamwork, but alumni consistently reported that failure to comply perfectly could trigger corrective measures. Academic classes formed a component of daily life, though interviews with former students indicate that behavior compliance was often prioritized over traditional learning. Core subjects such as mathematics, English, and science were offered, but students were closely monitored for obedience and attentiveness. Instructors and staff maintained authority over classrooms, and public confrontation or criticism could be applied when students failed to follow rules. Former students recalled that even minor infractions, such as speaking out of turn or failing to complete assignments on time, were met with immediate correction. Behavioral modification exercises were central to the regimen. Group sessions required students to reflect on their actions, often in the presence of peers and staff, and to participate in exercises designed to foster accountability. Alumni accounts describe these sessions as intense and emotionally charged, sometimes involving verbal confrontation or public acknowledgement of perceived misbehavior. Participation was mandatory, and refusal to engage could result in isolation, additional chores, or physical restraint. Staff supervised each session closely to ensure adherence to the institution's behavioral protocols. Physical restraint was documented as a method of enforcing compliance in specific situations. According to verified reports and alumni interviews, staff applied restraint when a student resisted instructions or exhibited behavior considered disruptive. Isolation from peers was another disciplinary tool, with students sometimes placed alone in designated rooms for hours or even days depending on the infraction. While the school maintained that these measures were implemented for safety and behavioral correction, former students consistently described experiences of fear and emotional stress. Mealtimes and recreational periods were also structured and closely supervised. Students ate together under staff observation, with expectations for behavior, posture, and conversation. Recreation was limited to organized, monitored activities such as walking, cleaning tasks, or supervised games, rather than free play. Alumni accounts indicate that even periods of personal hygiene or quiet reflection were regulated and observed by staff, reinforcing the sense of constant oversight. Staffing was organized in a hierarchical manner to maintain continuous supervision. Senior administrators oversaw campus operations and disciplinary protocols, while counselors and residential monitors executed day-to-day enforcement. Former staff reported that training emphasized authority, consistency, and behavioral enforcement rather than traditional therapeutic or educational guidance. High staff turnover, documented in interviews and internal reports, reflected both the challenges of enforcing intensive routines and the emotional strain of the work. Medical and psychological support at Elan was limited relative to the intensity of its behavioral programs. Licensed professionals were present intermittently, but much of the behavioral intervention and corrective measures were carried out by staff without formal therapeutic credentials. Verified accounts from alumni and court filings indicate that students sometimes experienced high-intensity interventions without professional oversight, including restraint and confrontational exercises. Overall, the daily life at Elan combined rigorous routines, work-based responsibility, behavioral exercises, and structured education into a tightly controlled environment. Alumni consistently described the cumulative effect as one of constant monitoring, intense pressure to comply, and limited opportunities for private or voluntary activity. While some students and families acknowledged benefits such as discipline, routine, and improved responsibility, verified accounts also document emotional distress, fear, and long-term psychological impact. The structured nature of daily life, the intensity of behavioral interventions, and the hierarchical oversight by staff were defining characteristics of Elan School for the entire duration of its operation. Beyond structured academic and behavioral activities, life at Elan School involved additional layers of supervision and evaluation that shaped students' experiences. Verified alumni accounts describe a system of daily assessments, where staff monitored adherence to rules, completion of chores, and participation in behavioral exercises. Students were often required to report on their own behavior and that of their peers, reinforcing a culture of accountability and peer monitoring. Staff maintained detailed records of infractions, progress, and compliance, which could influence privileges, responsibilities, or placement within the campus hierarchy. Even minor deviations from expected behavior could have consequences. Alumni testimonies confirm that failing to properly perform chores, speaking without permission, or showing emotional resistance could lead to corrective measures such as timeout, isolation, additional labor assignments, or mandatory participation in confrontational sessions. These interventions were documented in staff manuals and corroborated in investigative reports as consistent components of the school's operational philosophy. Physical routines and labor tasks extended beyond classroom instruction. Students engaged in maintenance of the campus grounds, including snow removal in winter, landscaping, and repairs. According to verified accounts, the work was intended to instill discipline and responsibility, but alumni describe it as physically demanding and often closely supervised to ensure compliance. Failure to complete assignments properly or on schedule could trigger immediate corrective action. Recreational and social interactions were similarly structured. While students sometimes had access to physical exercise or limited outdoor time, all such activities were supervised by staff. Alumni recall that free socialization was rare, and peer interactions were frequently mediated through behavioral expectations or group accountability exercises. Even leisure time was framed as an extension of the school's behavioral program, emphasizing reflection, observation, and adherence to rules rather than voluntary choice. Meal times were another point of scrutiny. Students ate together in communal dining spaces under the watch of staff members, with expectations regarding table manners, conversational restraint, and obedience to directions. Any deviation could result in correction, ranging from verbal reprimand to reassignment of chores. These routines reinforced a sense of constant observation and contributed to the overall intensity of the environment. Even sleep and personal hygiene were structured. Bedtimes were strictly enforced, often accompanied by nighttime checks from staff to ensure compliance. Dormitories were organized according to staff directives, and students were expected to maintain personal spaces in accordance with institutional rules. Alumni accounts confirm that this level of oversight contributed to a continuous awareness of being monitored, shaping students' behavior around compliance rather than autonomy. Staff hierarchy played a critical role in the enforcement of routines. Senior administrators directed policy and disciplinary protocols, while counselors, residential monitors, and support personnel implemented daily supervision. Training for staff emphasized consistent enforcement of rules, behavioral correction, and immediate response to infractions. Alumni interviews suggest that this hierarchical model created an environment in which students were constantly accountable to both staff and peers, further intensifying the regimented structure of daily life. Medical and psychological support remained limited, particularly in relation to the intensity of behavioral interventions. While licensed professionals were occasionally involved, the bulk of supervision, correction, and behavioral exercises was carried out by staff without formal therapeutic credentials. Verified sources, including investigative reports and court filings, indicate that this gap contributed to instances where interventions caused emotional or psychological strain for students. Through these multiple layers of oversight, academic, behavioral, physical, and social, Elan's daily regimen maintained a pervasive intensity. Students experienced a life in which every moment was monitored and every action evaluated. Alumni consistently report that this structure reinforced compliance, authority, and hierarchy, while simultaneously contributing to fear, emotional stress, and in some cases lasting psychological impact. Former students of the Elan School provide a detailed and often intense perspective on daily life at the institution. Verified accounts consistently describe an environment that combines structure, behavioral intervention, and strict authority, producing experiences that were both formative and emotionally challenging. Students recalled arriving on campus as disoriented and uncertain. Many were teenagers sent by families concerned about behavioral issues, academic struggles, or early substance use. Upon arrival, students were immediately introduced to the school's strict hierarchy and regimented routines. Alumni interviews described the initial orientation as both informative and intimidating. Students were assigned to dormitories, introduced to chores, and briefed on the rules and consequences for infractions. A recurring theme in human accounts is the intensity of behavioral modification sessions. These group exercises required students to participate in discussions about personal conduct, often in the presence of peers and staff. Alumni report that participation was mandatory, and refusal or resistance could result in isolation, additional work, or corrective intervention. While the school presented these sessions as therapeutic, former students described them as emotionally charged and, at times, humiliating. Physical restraint and isolation were commonly reported disciplinary measures. Alumni accounts confirm that staff applied restraints when students resisted instructions or engaged in disruptive behavior. Isolation from peers, sometimes lasting hours or days, was used to enforce compliance. Verified testimonies indicate that these measures, while framed by the school as behavioral tools, often created fear and emotional stress among students. Daily chores, labor tasks, and structured routines were also central to students' experiences. Former students reported performing cleaning, laundry, maintenance, and outdoor work under constant supervision. Failure to complete tasks properly or on time could trigger immediate correction. Similarly, recreation, meals, and personal hygiene were tightly regulated, with staff monitoring adherence to rules. Alumni describe a pervasive sense of oversight that extended into nearly every aspect of life at the school. Some students described positive outcomes, such as developing discipline, time management, and a sense of responsibility. Parents occasionally noted behavioral improvements, academic engagement, or enhanced structure in their children's lives. However, these outcomes were frequently accompanied by reports of emotional distress, anxiety, or long-lasting psychological impact, particularly for those who experienced confrontational sessions, isolation, or restraint. Staff members also provided verified accounts of life at Elan. Interviews indicate that employees were expected to enforce rules consistently, maintain constant supervision, and administer behavioral interventions according to institutional protocols. Staff reported that the intensity of the work created stress and moral tension, particularly in situations involving confrontational exercises or physical restraint. High staff turnover, corroborated by investigative reports and internal documentation, reflected the challenges of working in such a regimented environment. Legal filings and media investigations corroborate alumni and staff accounts. Lawsuits filed against Elan detailed allegations of abuse, mistreatment, and lack of adequate professional oversight during behavioral interventions. Investigative journalism collected hundreds of interviews with former students and staff, confirming recurring patterns of strict supervision, intensive behavioral exercises, and emotionally challenging routines. These sources collectively provide a verified record of the human experiences within the school, revealing both the intended educational and behavioral outcomes and the emotional and physical challenges faced by students. Through these accounts, a nuanced understanding of Elan emerges, an institution that operated with strict discipline and structured interventions, whose programs were experienced differently by each student, producing both reported behavioral improvements and emotional hardship. The human stories, corroborated by investigative reporting and legal documentation, remain central to understanding the legacy of the school. Beyond the general structure and behavioral interventions, alumni accounts reveal additional dimensions of life at Elan School that shaped students' experiences. Many former students reported peer accountability practices that extended beyond formal behavioral sessions. Senior or more experienced students were sometimes assigned authority over newer students, observing their behavior and reporting infractions to staff. Verified interviews indicate that this peer monitoring system reinforced the hierarchical environment, increasing pressure on students to comply at all times. Some former students also described experiencing emotional manipulation or verbal confrontation as part of the daily regimen. In group settings, staff would sometimes require students to acknowledge mistakes publicly, criticize their own behavior, or respond to pointed questioning from peers and supervisors. Alumni accounts confirm that, while intended as behavioral exercises, these sessions could induce significant stress, anxiety, or humiliation. Multiple interviews corroborate that such confrontations were frequent and structured rather than isolated incidents. Physical strain was another dimension of daily life highlighted in human accounts. Alumni frequently described labor assignments as physically demanding, including extensive cleaning, campus maintenance, and outdoor tasks in Maine's variable climate. According to verified testimonies, students were required to complete these tasks under strict supervision, with correction applied for perceived lapses in effort, timeliness, or precision. The combination of physical labor, emotional confrontation, and constant oversight contributed to a sense of exhaustion and heightened stress among students. Medical and mental health support, while available in some limited capacity, was described by alumni as insufficient relative to the intensity of the program. Students experiencing emotional distress, anxiety, or fear during behavioral sessions often had minimal access to licensed professionals. Verified accounts from former staff and investigative journalism indicate that much of the supervision and intervention was performed by staff without formal therapeutic credentials, heightening the emotional challenges experienced by students. Interactions with families also formed a part of the human experience. Alumni reported that contact with parents was limited and highly regulated. Letters and phone calls were sometimes monitored by staff, and visits were scheduled according to strict protocols. These restrictions contributed to a sense of isolation from family support, intensifying the impact of the school's regimented environment. Verified reports indicate that families were generally aware of the school's structured programs and disciplinary methods, but alumni accounts suggest that the full intensity of daily life was not always conveyed prior to enrollment. Alumni advocacy and post-closure reporting have further revealed long-term effects of life at Elan. Many former students report lingering psychological and emotional impacts stemming from the intense behavioral exercises, physical labor, and restrictive routines. While some former students acknowledge positive outcomes, such as improved time management or responsibility, others recount experiences of anxiety, stress, and trauma that persisted well beyond their time at the school. These accounts have been documented in interviews, court filings, and media investigations, providing additional verified insight into the human consequences of the institution's programs. Overall, these verified human accounts illustrate a complex reality. Students' experiences encompass strict oversight, structured labor, emotionally charged behavioral sessions, and regulated family contact. resulting in a spectrum of responses ranging from reported improvement to emotional distress. Staff testimonies and investigative reports corroborate these patterns, confirming that the human experience at Elan was shaped by both the school's operational philosophy and the intensity of its day-to-day practices. Elan School's operational structure combined educational instruction, behavioral interventions, and residential oversight, but alumni accounts and investigative reporting reveal several systemic anomalies in how the program functioned. One key aspect was the inconsistent application of professional standards. While the school employed licensed counselors and occasional medical personnel, much of the supervision and behavioral enforcement was performed by staff without formal credentials. Investigative reports and court filings indicate that confrontational sessions, physical restraint, and isolation protocols were often administered by individuals trained only in the school's internal procedures rather than in recognized therapeutic techniques. Staffing ratios and training practices also contributed to operational anomalies. Verified accounts indicate that staffing levels varied depending on enrollment, sometimes resulting in fewer personnel than required for continuous supervision. Former employees reported that staff were expected to enforce rules rigorously, yet had limited formal guidance on managing high-stress situations. This combination of limited professional oversight and rigid behavioral protocols occasionally led to situations in which students were subjected to intense interventions without sufficient clinical evaluation. Another anomaly involved the use of behavioral logs and student assessments. The school maintained detailed records of student infractions, progress, and compliance with rules, but investigative journalism and alumni interviews suggest that these logs were sometimes inconsistently applied or relied on subjective evaluations from staff. Peer monitoring was integrated into the assessment system, with senior students reporting on the conduct of newer students. While the system was intended to reinforce accountability, it could also amplify stress, fear, and conflict among students, contributing to a culture in which compliance was enforced socially as well as institutionally. Daily operations further reveal anomalies in the balance between education, labor, and behavioral correction. Academic instruction was conducted alongside chores, labor, and intensive behavioral exercises, but former students and staff reported that the focus on behavioral compliance frequently overshadowed educational priorities. Investigative reports and alumni accounts note that disciplinary interventions sometimes interrupted classes or required students to participate in confrontational exercises immediately before or after academic periods. The blending of labor, schooling, and behavioral correction created an operational environment that was unusually rigid and physically demanding for adolescent students. The use of physical restraint and isolation also reflects operational inconsistencies. Official staff manuals described restraint as a safety measure, yet verified accounts indicate that its application was frequent and sometimes applied for reasons unrelated to immediate physical danger. Isolation procedures similarly varied in duration and enforcement, with some students reporting stays lasting hours or multiple days. Investigative journalism and legal filings confirm that these practices, while codified in school procedures, lacked formal clinical oversight and were inconsistently documented. Finally, communication and oversight anomalies extended to family interaction. Contact with parents was tightly controlled, with letters and phone calls sometimes monitored by staff. Families received updates on student behavior and progress, but alumni accounts suggest that the intensity of daily behavioral enforcement was not always fully conveyed. State inspections documented some compliance with licensing requirements, yet oversight gaps allowed operational practices to persist without independent evaluation of their therapeutic efficacy. These technical and operational anomalies collectively reveal how Elan's institutional design, staffing practices, and procedural inconsistencies contributed to both its controversial reputation and the intensity of student experiences. While the school maintained official licensing and presented its programs as therapeutic, verified evidence indicates that operational structures frequently prioritized control, compliance, and enforcement over traditional educational or clinical standards. Further examination of Elan School's operational framework reveals additional anomalies in protocol enforcement and administrative oversight. Verified alumni accounts indicate that, despite the school's formal rules and manuals, staff often applied procedures inconsistently. For example, behavioral sessions and confrontational exercises were supposed to follow structured guidelines, but former students reported wide variation in execution depending on which staff member supervised. Investigative journalism corroborates these reports, highlighting that institutional oversight sometimes failed to ensure uniformity across groups or dormitories. Staff training presented another operational anomaly. While employees were instructed in Elan-specific disciplinary and behavioral methods, many lacked prior experience in adolescent mental health care or formal pedagogical training. Alumni and staff interviews confirm that new employees were often trained on the job, learning procedural enforcement from senior staff rather than through recognized clinical or educational programs. This approach allowed for operational continuity but increased the likelihood of subjective interpretations of rules and inconsistent application of behavioral interventions. Documentation practices also contributed to anomalies. Staff maintained logs of student behavior, chores, and compliance, but investigative reports indicate these records were often incomplete or inconsistent. Peer-reported infractions, a key part of the school's accountability system, added a layer of subjectivity. Alumni described situations where disagreements among students or reporting errors could escalate to staff intervention, sometimes triggering isolation or restraint based on incomplete information. Court filings later referenced these discrepancies as evidence of procedural irregularities. Operational design also emphasized labor and physical tasks in ways that conflicted with educational priorities. Verified accounts describe schedules in which academic classes were regularly interrupted for chores, campus maintenance, or mandatory behavioral sessions. In some cases, students were required to perform physically demanding work immediately before or after academic instruction, leaving little time for rest or focus on learning. Investigative reports and alumni testimonies highlight that this blending of labor, therapy, and schooling contributed to fatigue and stress, affecting student engagement and well-being. Even safety protocols demonstrated inconsistencies. While restraint and isolation were codified in staff manuals as measures for controlling dangerous behavior, alumni accounts suggest that staff sometimes applied these measures for less severe infractions or perceived defiance. Investigative journalism and legal filings confirm that documentation of these interventions was uneven, with no independent verification that each instance adhered strictly to safety guidelines. Communication anomalies further affected operational transparency. Families were periodically updated on student progress, but monitoring of letters and phone calls, coupled with selective reporting of behavioral issues, limited accurate portrayal of day-to-day life. Alumni testimonies indicate that parents were sometimes unaware of the intensity or frequency of confrontational sessions, isolation periods, and physical interventions. Maine Department of Health and Human Services records corroborate that inspections verified compliance with basic licensing standards, but did not systematically evaluate the psychological impact or appropriateness of operational methods. These operational anomalies, ranging from inconsistent procedural application, limited staff training, subjective peer reporting, labor academic conflicts, uneven application of restraint, and restricted communication with families, created a complex and high-pressure environment for students. While the school maintained a framework intended to promote structure and behavioral correction, verified evidence demonstrates that operational inconsistencies contributed significantly to the intensity, stress, and controversy surrounding life at Elan. Elan School operated under the licensing authority of the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, and it presented itself to parents, regulatory bodies, and the public as a therapeutic and educational institution. However, multiple verified sources revealed discrepancies between official representations and actual practices. Investigative reports and alumni testimonies indicate that the school often emphasized strict behavioral modification and regimented labor while minimizing or underreporting the intensity of confrontational methods, physical restraint, and isolation procedures in communications with families and regulators. Licensing inspections conducted by the state verified that Elan met certain operational standards, such as facility safety, staffing ratios, and basic documentation of student care. Yet, alumni accounts and court filings suggest that these inspections did not fully capture the day-to-day application of behavioral interventions. For instance, restraint and isolation protocols were codified in staff manuals, but actual implementation often exceeded what families were informed or what regulators could observe during inspections. Legal filings later described instances where students were isolated for extended periods, sometimes for reasons not documented in official records. Court cases and lawsuits also highlighted discrepancies in the school's representation of staff qualifications. Official documents listed counselors and staff with specified credentials, but investigative journalism and verified alumni accounts indicate that many staff members lacked formal training in adolescent mental health or therapeutic techniques. While the school maintained that all interventions were therapeutic in nature, alumni testimonies and internal documentation show that non-licensed staff carried out confrontational sessions, behavioral monitoring, and physical interventions. Another area of official discrepancy involved academic and therapeutic claims. Marketing materials and communications to parents emphasized educational advancement and emotional growth. Alumni accounts, corroborated by investigative reporting, indicate that academic instruction was frequently interrupted or deprioritized in favor of chores, labor, and mandatory behavioral exercises. The discrepancy between promotional claims and the lived experience of students highlights a gap between institutional representation and operational reality. Communication with families was also inconsistent with official claims. Letters, phone calls, and visits were monitored and controlled by staff. While the school maintained that it encouraged parental involvement and transparency, alumni accounts suggest that families were often unaware of the intensity and frequency of confrontational sessions, isolation periods, or physical interventions. This discrepancy between reported student experiences and parental perception contributed to the school's controversial reputation. Finally, court filings and investigative journalism document discrepancies in incident reporting. Allegations of excessive restraint, emotional distress, and neglect were sometimes not fully reflected in internal records. While the school maintained logs and incident reports, verified accounts suggest that these records occasionally omitted context, duration, or intensity of interventions, creating an official record that differed from the human experiences of students. These verified discrepancies illustrate that, while Elan School operated under formal licensing and presented itself as a therapeutic institution, the lived experience of students frequently diverged from official representations. The gaps between policy, promotion, and practice contributed to long-term scrutiny by journalists, alumni advocacy groups, and the legal system, forming a key part of the school's historical legacy. Further examination of official records reveals additional discrepancies in Elan School's operation. Alumni accounts and investigative journalism indicate that the school's reporting of behavioral incidents to state regulators often downplayed the severity or frequency of confrontational sessions, isolation, and restraint. Internal incident logs, reviewed during legal proceedings, sometimes recorded minimal descriptions, such as student corrected or behavior managed, without detailing the methods used or the duration of intervention. These omissions created a gap between regulatory records and students' lived experiences. Staff qualifications were another area of official misalignment. Official materials submitted to licensing authorities claimed that staff were trained to handle adolescent behavioral and emotional challenges. However, alumni and former employee testimonies confirmed that many staff were trained primarily in Elan-specific procedural techniques, rather than in recognized clinical or educational standards. This disparity between official claims and staff capabilities became a central point in lawsuits and investigative reports, highlighting systemic oversight limitations. In addition, the school's marketing and promotional materials presented a therapeutic framework that emphasized emotional growth, accountability, and educational advancement. Verified accounts from alumni and parents indicate that the actual balance of academic instruction, behavioral intervention, and physical labor often differed significantly. Students spent extended periods in confrontational sessions or performing chores under strict supervision, with limited academic focus. Investigative journalism notes that this misalignment between promotion and practice contributed to families' misunderstanding of the school's environment. Regulatory oversight itself exhibited discrepancies. While Maine Department of Health and Human Services inspections verified compliance with basic licensing requirements, such as fire safety, dormitory conditions, and minimum staff ratios, they did not systematically evaluate the emotional or psychological impact of Elan's behavioral methods. Alumni accounts and investigative reporting suggest that the school operated with considerable autonomy in the implementation of confrontational exercises, restraint, and isolation, resulting in a gap between official approval and actual daily practice. Discrepancies were also evident in communications with families. Staff monitored letters, phone calls, and visits, controlling the information parents received. While the school claimed to maintain transparency and encourage parental involvement, verified alumni testimonies indicate that parents often received only partial information about the intensity of behavioral interventions, the use of restraint, or incidents of emotional distress. Legal filings corroborate that this communication gap contributed to families' misperceptions of the school's daily operations. Finally, legal records show that Elan sometimes failed to fully report injuries or incidents to regulatory bodies. Court documents reference cases in which students experienced physical or emotional harm during interventions, yet official reporting minimized these events or failed to capture their severity. This disparity between official documentation and the realities reported by students underscores the systemic inconsistencies in oversight, reporting, and institutional accountability. Collectively, these verified discrepancies demonstrate that Elan School's official claims, regulatory approvals, and internal documentation frequently diverged from students' actual experiences. While the school maintained an image of a structured, therapeutic environment, verified evidence indicates that the intensity of behavioral interventions, the application of restraint and isolation, and gaps in staff training often went underrepresented in official records. These discrepancies contributed to the scrutiny, legal challenges, and ongoing controversy surrounding the school's practices. By the late 2000s, scrutiny of Elan School had intensified. Investigative journalism, alumni advocacy, and legal filings had brought widespread attention to the school's disciplinary methods, use of physical restraint, confrontational behavioral sessions, and inconsistencies in operational oversight. Maine's Department of Health and Human Services continued to issue licensing approvals, but increasing public concern and documentation of student complaints placed the school under growing pressure. In 2011, after more than 4 decades of operation, Elan School officially closed. Verified accounts from alumni and staff indicate that the closure resulted from a combination of declining enrollment, heightened regulatory scrutiny, and public criticism fueled by media investigations and lawsuits. At the time of closure, hundreds of former students had already come forward with testimonies documenting their experiences, ranging from reported behavioral improvements to significant emotional and psychological distress. Post-closure, alumni advocacy groups played a central role in documenting the school's legacy. Verified accounts, interviews, and written testimonies collected by journalists and advocacy organizations highlighted patterns of strict behavioral enforcement, emotional confrontation, labor-intensive routines, and limited professional oversight. These accounts contributed to a broader understanding of the systemic issues within Elan and served as part of a growing critique of the troubled teen industry in the United States. Legal proceedings continued after the school's closure. Lawsuits and claims filed against Elan and its operators cited allegations of excessive restraint, isolation, and mistreatment, as well as misrepresentation of staff qualifications and operational practices. Court documents, investigative journalism, and alumni testimonies collectively provide a verified record of the school's practices and the human experiences of those affected. While not every claim resulted in formal judgment, the accumulation of documentation and reporting solidified Elan's controversial legacy. The closure of Elan also influenced public discourse and policy regarding residential programs for adolescents. Journalists, mental health professionals, and advocacy groups used the verified experiences of former students to highlight risks associated with unregulated or underregulated behavioral programs. These discussions contributed to increased awareness, oversight, and debate surrounding the ethical and operational standards of the troubled teen industry. Today, the legacy of Elan School is viewed through the dual lenses of its intended disciplinary and therapeutic goals and the documented challenges, emotional hardships, and controversies experienced by its students. Alumni accounts, investigative reports, and legal records collectively present a verified, factual understanding of the school. A highly structured institution that operated with intensity and rigor, producing both reported improvements in some students and significant emotional and psychological impacts for others. While the campus no longer operates as a residential program, the experiences of those who lived and worked at Elan continue to inform ongoing scrutiny of similar programs, highlighting the importance of transparency, professional oversight, and the potential consequences of intensive behavioral interventions without consistent clinical supervision. Following the 2011 closure, former students increasingly organized to share their experiences publicly. Verified alumni interviews, published articles, and documentaries document a range of outcomes. Some alumni credited Elan with instilling discipline or structure, while others described long-term emotional distress linked to confrontational sessions, isolation, and strict behavioral enforcement. These accounts collectively contributed to a public reassessment of the school's practices and their effects on adolescent mental health. Alumni advocacy groups created online forums, social media pages, and organized reunions to document and verify individual experiences. Investigative journalism drew extensively from these sources, highlighting patterns across decades of operation. Stories collected emphasized both the rigor of the program and the emotional intensity students endured, providing a substantial factual record that supplemented official reports and court filings. Legal proceedings and settlements continued to shape Elan's post-closure legacy. Verified court documents include claims of physical restraint, psychological harm, and misrepresentation of staff credentials. While some cases were settled confidentially and others dismissed due to legal technicalities, these filings confirmed recurring issues reported by students and highlighted the discrepancies between the school's promotional materials and the lived experiences of adolescents. The closure of Elan School also had a wider impact on the troubled teen industry. Policymakers, mental health professionals, and investigative journalists used verified accounts from Elan alumni to advocate for stricter oversight of residential programs. Reports and articles documented systemic patterns, such as high staff turnover, limited professional oversight, and the intensive use of behavioral interventions, emphasizing the potential consequences when institutions prioritize conformity and control over clinical supervision. In the years after closure, the Elan campus remained vacant, but its reputation continued to influence discussions around adolescent care. Verified alumni interviews indicate that the emotional and psychological effects of the program persisted for many years, including challenges with trust, authority, and interpersonal relationships. These long-term outcomes underscore the significance of operational practices, staff training, and oversight in residential treatment settings. Elan's legacy is now preserved primarily through documentation, testimony, and advocacy. Alumni narratives, court filings, and investigative journalism collectively form a verified historical record of the school's operational methods, human experiences, and institutional anomalies. While some former students view their time at Elan as formative, others regard it as traumatic, illustrating the complex, multifaceted impact of the program. Ultimately, Elan School's closure marked the end of its operations, but not the end of its influence. Verified accounts continue to inform debates about adolescent behavioral programs, residential treatment standards, and the ethical implementation of behavioral interventions. The school serves as a case study in the importance of professional oversight, transparency, and the careful balance between discipline and care in institutions serving vulnerable populations. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below and stay tuned for more fascinating real-life stories.